So which armies were the biggest winners and losers out of 40k's recent balance update? Let's talk through each faction in turn and whether the changes sent them in a positive or negative direction. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where over the last couple of days I've been talking a fair bit about 40k's massive new balance update. A pretty crazy amount of new changes, both to the core game itself and to all manner of different armies, both for rules and points. And in this video I thought we'd just sum up the major changes for each army, roughly where they were before power-wise, and whether I think the overall balance of changes has helped or hindered them in terms of how strong they'll be. As we've talked about in the last few videos, this update was a rather enormous and multifaceted one. One of the single biggest digital balance passes that Warhammer 40k has ever done. Looks like their ethos is to save up all their changes for big yearly updates, but try and keep things a bit more low-key in between besides codex releases. In this one we had the balanced Dataslate rules changes, the core rules updates and FAQs, points updates in the Minotaur and Field Manual, including the first one for Genestealers and Sisters, new erratas and FAQs for all the factions, some of which were kind of meaningful, and a few units going to Legends for Tyranids and Necrons. In this one I thought we'd go through each faction quickly and talk about where they are relative to how strong they were before. Before we start, I just wanted to mention one way in which you can help support the channel if you'd like to. If you were thinking about ordering in any 40k miniatures or other hobbying supplies, there's a whole bunch of discount retailers from around the world that offer discounts versus buying from Games Workshop, and if you do click on any of those links before ordering, a small amount goes to help support Auspex Tactics and all the videos that I make. It can just be a way to help support the channel on things that you were going to pick up anyway, and of course get a discount versus the Games Workshop web store, which is usually a good idea. And as always, a big thank you to you guys who are using those. Jumping straight in though, we'll start with the Imperium, then go through Chaos and Xenos. Space Marines had a win rate of 44% prior to the update, and their balance situation is in a weird place due to divergent chapters just doing flatly better with their own detachments than what they can. As a result, their win rate's probably a little bit deflated from what it should be, but it is kind of annoying that they just don't have good reasons to play core codex versus divergent chapters with all the extra options that they get to access. In the update, it was more nerfs than buffs, unfortunately. The main thing that was hit was the Ironstorm spearhead from a few different angles, the Storm Raven and 2 Gladiator tanks went up, the Mercier's weakness stratagem and a couple of enhancements also went up for the Ironstorm, and that detachment looks significantly weaker than it was before, which is definitely a power cut to Space Marines given that it was one of their strongest armies. The Land Raider Redeemer also went up kind of significantly, and that was one of the Space Marines' strongest datasheets out there, so again that's not good news for delivering things to melee. They did get some boosts. The Land Raider Crusade and Repulsor both went down. Impulsors can transport 7 models, which is nice for Blade Guard. The captains have their stratagem change, which is perhaps more impactful for Space Marines than most places. You can do things like free Overwatch with them now, which is nice. And Primarchs being able to walk through ruined walls is a positive, helps Gilliman get a bit more flexibility as to where he walks. Overall, I feel like this is maybe a bit of a side grade if you're playing other detachments that weren't Ironstorm. Kind of depends on whether you're using a Land Raider Redeemer or not, but certainly a fairly enormous nerf to Ironstorm Spearhead. I feel like overall Space Marines kind of lose as a result. Having one of their best armies nerfed pretty hard is not a great thing. Overall, for that reason, I call them slight losers here. Next up, the Astra Militarum were winning around about 46% of games, as they've been for most of the edition, and they got a fairly mixed data slate, some genuinely good buffs, but some genuinely massive nerfs. Lots of artillery went down in points cost, but it also got hit very hard by never hitting better than a 4+, given that you could have Basilisk and Manticores that were often hitting on a 2+ between Sentinels and Orders. That's genuinely quite a big deal to damage output, and they also lost lethal hits as well, given that it never works with Born Soldiers with them anymore, seeing as artillery was really quite a powerful thing for the Guard, and Games Workshop hit it very hard with this. That certainly feels like a fairly fearsome nerf. Otherwise, for the points changes, cheaper Dawns, Kazakin and Armoured Sentinels I think are all competitively relevant cuts. Dawns at 240 are just intimidating, Kazakin was still being used in competitive, and Armoured Sentinels did well out of the Born Soldiers change, getting lethal hits literally all the time now. Otherwise, for rules changes, reinforcements is once per game now, and given that that was a strong and often used stratagem, it hurts Guard hard, perhaps particularly foot Guard armies that take loads of blocks of 20-man models. And then the other big change is to Born Soldiers, which is interesting. I feel like broadly that's a positive change. It has unfortunately just completely gone for indirect fire. But for squadron units, you get to get lethal hits against monsters and vehicles, so tanks are good at killing big stuff, and lethal hits for anything else for regiment units, which is really quite impactful for las guns, and you get both of those on the move. Overall, I'd say that's broadly a buff to plenty of units out there besides artillery. Really nice not to compromise between moving and getting your detachment rule. It's just a bit awkward for some things like tanks that wanted to destroy infantry, say things like wyverns. Otherwise, perhaps for slightly smaller things, tank shot got a little bit better for them, given that they've got good toughness values. Creed can't just hand out automatic fields of fire every turn without spending 1 CP now, as it's a 2 CP stratagem, and Kazakin were confirmed that you can't double stack orders, which I think maybe was a bit open for interpretation before. Overall, on the balance of things, it really did depend on what sort of army you were using. I'd probably argue that Guard perhaps slightly lost out compared with before. The artillery nerf and the reinforcement changes are kind of massive ones, even if Born Soldiers really does help out a lot of other units out there. All the points cuts are handy as well, though they are just on 3 datasheets, they're not exactly broad reaching. I feel like with Sentinels getting lethal hits all the times and Dawns down at 240, both of those are a bit more likely to be taken. I wouldn't be too surprised if their win rate stays very, very similar to what it is now though. For the AdMech, their pre-update tournament stats were win rates of around about 44%. Broadly speaking, their points cost went up to make way for powerful extra rules boost and datasheet weapon profiles getting increased. That basically means that the army is going to be generally less durable per point, but it's going to be more dangerous after the rules changes, I think. The big thing was the much better doctrine or imperatives that they get. The Protector one gives you heavy, but now also just gives you flat +1 extra ballistic skill, -1 to hit in melee. And the Assault one gives you +1 weapon skill and an extra AP if you're near battle line as well. And both of those are just incredibly powerful rules now. Either one could be the right choice depending on the army that you've got and the turn that you are in. AdMech certainly feel like they can gun line a lot harder with that +1 ballistic skill, giving them accuracy as they're moving around, and the extra AP debuff could be enormous against some high save armies. Otherwise, there were better weapon profiles for Rust Stalkers, Onagers, Ironstrider Ballistari, and Scorpius Disintegrators, combined with the chance to get far better damage output with those Doctriners as well. All of these look genuinely pretty scary. I feel like they were worth the points increases. Besides that, Core can move through walls, he moves 8 inches, and can be battle line for other buffs when he needs to be. The Dune Rider found a firing deck, and the Hunter cohort had a couple of small nerfs to a stratagem and an enhancement, the one for redeploying things, and the stratagem for not being shot outside of 12 inches, that's now 18. Overall, between all that, I'd say they've overall done quite well out of this. The boosted weapon profiles are really nice and make those individual units a lot better. But I feel like the real win here are those Doctriner imperatives. They do just kind of amount to a flat boost to the army overall. And it's pretty massive that a fair few units didn't actually go up in cost. Things like the Cataphren Destroyers, they get all the benefit of those new Doctriners without any extra cost. The points cost bumps feel like they're proportionate and not excessive. And they also mean that practically affecting AdMech just got a little bit cheaper to get to a 2,000 point list, rather than having all their units be super cheap and ineffectual on the board. For the Sisters, they're all a bit new with their new codex. Generally speaking, the book looks like an incredibly powerful one. Lots of detachments gained a lot of strength with things like double acts of faith, massive shooting buffs from the Bringers of Flame one, and other interesting rules. And then a whole ton of datasheets either got stat line buffs or datasheet ability buffs, things like Paragon Warsuits hitting on +1 to hit and wound monsters and vehicles, or the Triumph of St. Catherine just spawning you some extra 6 miracle dice. As a result, it was kind of expected that they'd get big points rises, which indeed they did. And in all honesty, at this point, it's hard to know whether or not that's going to get outweighed by the points cost increases. Feels like they are going to be an army with fewer units on the board, but lots of those units are just going to cause absolute devastation when they get to attack the enemy, with a combination of some nasty detachment rules and miracle dice. Otherwise, I guess the Canoness stratagem changes were quite a good one. It means that they're really quite a nice choice in most of the detachments now, and a bit less dependent on battle tactics. I guess from these first impressions are they're probably going to wind up neither stand out strong nor stand out weak, and probably significantly better in the hands of good players building lists to absolutely optimize the combos that the detachments can offer. Maybe a little bit unforgiving if you just try and play them quite simply and march them up the board to deal damage, but I guess we'll have to see where they land when tournament players put theory into practice. Next up, we've got the Adeptus Custodes, who are hoping for some help from this with their kind of poor win rate that they had before at 45% post their disappointing codex. They weren't completely out of the running and could still put a lot of golden armour on the board, but weren't having any particularly good success at grand tournaments. It does seem that Games Workshop have given them a few fun boosts to make them a bit more impactful. On the points side of things, interestingly enough, it was entirely Forge World that got points cuts. Most of their Forge World range was pretty underwhelming really, and they got cuts to their Forge World Terminators and bikes, the Pyrothite Spear Custodian Guard, the Palace Gravatak, and the Telemon Dreadnoughts, which were both overcosted. I think that easily the best points cut they got for Forge World were the Venatari Custodians dropping down from 200 to 165, which seems huge to me. They were already being run in competitive lists from time to time with their free rapid ingress things they could do, dropping a huge 35 points. Feels like they're honestly kind of auto-include to me now. Otherwise, the devastating wound change is really big, as all their mortal wound protection works against devastating wounds again. They get it in Talons of the Emperor and stratagems elsewhere. The shield host was buffed, rather than just getting all your damage on one really big turn. You just basically get a flat melee boost across the whole game, choosing one of two buffs each time you fight. And also the Castellan's Mark, one of their better enhancements, dropped to 20 points. Auric Champions got significantly better. You get a +1 to wound for your entire units led by characters, not just the character miniatures themselves. And that means one target's going to get hit by some spectacular melee. That's really not bad for shooting either with Guardian Spears. Shield Captains will be better in Shield Host with the new stratagem rules, as there weren't many battle tactics there. And Allarus Terminators are confirmed to be able to do their teleport movement turn 1 in Pariah Nexus, which I think was already the case, but nice to have it doubly confirmed. Overall, they certainly feel like big winners compared with where they were before. The two detachments that were being played competitively for the most part were Shield Host and the Talons of the Emperor. Shield Host got way better on multiple fronts. Talons all like the devastating wound change, and I feel like one of the big wins is actually the Venatari seeing that points cut. They seem absolutely amazing at 165. Overall, they seem like solid winners to me. I'm sure they'll be heading back towards the upper end of 40k once more. Next up, we've got the Knights of Titan, who pre-updates were one of the strongest armies in 40k. Win rates were around about 55% and taking home lots of tournament trophies. For their points, you had increases to Dreadnoughts and Grandmaster Dreadnoughts, the Stormraver and Landraider Demon going up, similar to the Space Marine Codex, and Castellan Crow going up, perhaps a slightly surprising 15 points. As with Codex Space Marines, the Landraider Crusader went down a bit. Otherwise, they did take a few rules nerfs as well. Vortex of Doom can't target lone operatives that are greater than 12 inches away, and their 12 inches shooting denial stratagem haloed in Soulfire now becomes 18 inches, and that was really quite a big disruptive move that they could do, and that makes that a fair bit worse. And then the Dreadnoughts and Grandmaster Dreadnoughts will get the Captain style stratagem changes, even if it's once per battle. Overall, I feel like they have taken a blow here, but nothing that's too unrecoverable. For standard competitive lists, they might have been taking maybe something like 3 or 4 Dreadnoughts perhaps, between the regular ones and Grandmasters. That means that a lot of armies might likely pay an extra 30 or 40 points worth of tax, though I still think that Dreadnoughts are absolutely still going to get run in good numbers, given that they're the answer to heavy things and monsters and vehicles. The Haloed stratagem is an impactful one as well, though I certainly don't think this is enough to make Grey Knights weak. For the big stompy robots of the Imperial Knights, previously they were winning around about 50% of tournament games, kind of balanced on that, though as ever they tended to do better in more casual or local tournaments, as opposed to great big GTs having a bit of a skill ceiling. For their points cuts, they got changes to the Paladin, Lancer, Styrex, and Atropos, which all went down. The Paladin's kind of nice to see, as that wasn't played too much, and the Lancer was absolutely played, so that's a big win there. Mysterious Guardian and Revered Knight went down, and Mysterious Guardian again was a good one, allowing a big shooty knights to redeploy and get line of sight. And then for the most part, the rules changes were kind of favourable. Super heavy walkers can smash straight through terrain at the small risk of battle shock. That makes the Titanic ones a lot more interesting and a lot harder to box out and screen out of being able to get where they want. That's a very big deal for them. Canis Rex had improvements with his stratagem rule, which means he can do free rotate ion shields and get access to a bunch of other stratagems at discount, such as say free tank shock if he wanted it. Tank shocks themselves have maybe been toned down a bit with knights, a little bit better for Dominus ones, though worse for most other things that actually had good melee weapons. And on the mission points of view, the bring it down changes might help them a bit, though perhaps the focus on actions might be a bit unhelpful, even if the big knights can do them kind of well and not compromise their shooting. Overall though, looks good for the Imperial Knights. They were kind of alright before, and a direct buff to Canis Rex is a really big deal. He was already in the vast majority of competitive lists. I think Super Heavy Walker is another big deal for big knights, and the points changes are helpful enough. Taking a look at the Space Marine Divergent chapters, and Space Wolves were another one of the factions that were looking like one of the strongest armies in the game. One of the highest tournament win rates around about 56%, tending to be using their all-in Thunderwolf Stormlance. For points changes, perhaps kind of predictably, the Thunderwolves went up to 100, Wolfen also got a bump up to 90, which is maybe a shame for them given that they're also hit by the objective control 0 thing. Both them and Fenrisian Wolves won't be doing the new style actions. The big boost that they did get though was to the Champions of Rust detachment, which I think has just changed from being a fairly bad detachment to a genuinely good one. Starting with one of the Saga's access guarantees that it does something, and then you can hopefully work on acquiring one or more of the others, so you get some very empowered Space Wolves by the end of the game. The stratagems and things aren't awful as well, and really nice to see perhaps something that might draw a few players away from Stormlance. Otherwise, the Wolf Lords had those stratagem changes, they can't take the Apothecaries, Tactical Marines and Devastators anymore, and they got the same Space Marine changes like nerfs to Ironstorm and the Land Raider Redeemer. Perhaps Ragnar with 6 Blade Guard in an Impulsor does seem kind of fun though. That could be a ludicrous amount of threat transported by one cheap tank. Overall, despite the good stuff for Champions of Rust, I'd still say they're probably slight losers in terms of strict power. Top list, we're usually using 18 Thunderwolves, often with some Wolfen as well. So if you did want the same Thunderwolf Stormlance, that's paying an extra 60 points or more. Though I do think overall it's kind of fun for a bit more list variety. Hopefully this is enough to have people take up the Champions. For the Blood Angels, they were one of the least changed armies. Win rates are around about 50% and plenty of iconic assault units being usable, even if maybe I feel like Sanguinary Guard are still a little bit north of where they need to be points wise. They didn't get any specific Blood Angels changes at all, though I guess the Captain stratagem changes are pretty relevant for things like Assault Intercessors and Jump Intercessors, which they tend to lead. It does mean you wouldn't be able to double up on the big Red Rampage stratagem in Sons of Sanguinius though, which is kind of a shame. And some of the other Space Marine things might impact them. Again, Blade Guard in an Impulsor seem fun for Sons of Sanguinius, though if you're using a Land Raider Redeemer to deliver something like Foot Death Company, then that's taken a hit. Overall, I wouldn't really say they've changed massively from this, kind of similar to where they were before, as a lot of strong Sons of Sanguinius lists weren't using most of the things that got nerfed, and the Captain thing feels like a bit of a side grade. Overall pretty solid before, and remains solid now. For Dark Angels, they were certainly a codex that needed some big help. Their tournament stats were kind of dire at around about 42% win rate, and even that was largely propped up by Ironstorm Storm Ravens with Azrael and Darkshroud. That particular build has been hit on multiple different sides, with the Storm Raven and all the Ironstorm nerfs, but at least Games Workshop did give them some interesting changes to some of their elite damage dealer units, making both Deathwing Knights and Inner Circle Companions significantly more dangerous in combat. The Deathwing Knights get damage 2 on the swords, and then extra AP and anti-keywords on the maces. They did go up in points a bit, but overall they're a far better unit still. And Inner Circle Companions just went from kind of bad to genuinely interesting. Gaining AP 2 I think was the main thing that they needed, and they also gained an extra attack on their sweep profile. Like the Blade Guard, again you could have 6 of them in an Impulsor with a character. Otherwise, besides that, the Inner Circle Task Force gives one of your units +1 OC each turn. That could genuinely allow you to score a few more victory points, but on its own I don't think it's enough to make the Unforgiven Task Force suddenly good from being bad. And then the Inner Circle Task Force, that now gets a boost to assaulting objectives that you don't hold. Deathwing units get +1 to wound against enemy units that are on any objective that you don't control, determined at the start of the turn. That should mean that a good few more units across the board will get the damage buffs out of that detachment. Overall I feel in terms of in-game power, they're probably slight winners overall still, though I would bear in mind that the way that they were winning games before in Ironstorm Spearhead was nerfed really heavily. It does kind of remain to be seen whether or not, even with the buffs, the new units and the boosted detachments are going to be interesting enough to actually get them good. Hopefully Inner Circle Companions, or maybe Gladius with the Inner Circle Companions, or the Deathwing Knights will be enough to make them a lot more scary. For the Deathwatch, previously they were one of the weakest armies in the game, win rates are around about 42%, and near enough unplayed on the competitive scene unfortunately. In the Dataslate, the Games Workshop gave them a bit more than the neglect they had last time. The Watchmaster and Captain Artemis both go down a bit, and the Deathwatch veterans drop down from 110 to 100 points. I feel like that's quite a meaningful change, as the veterans were one of their better datasheets already. They can have some fairly threatening both range and melee builds. Besides that, a few of the core rules changes were pretty meaningful. The Watchmaster now has that new aura of CP debuffing, which seems alright for him as a frontline character. The bolt stratagems will be able to be activated by captains if you take them, but then Artemis, along with the points cut, does lose his double up on a stratagem thing, as that's basically gone game wide now. And if you're running anything else besides Black Spear Task Force, then you can't use Scouts, even if you're in the Codex detachments now. That's kind of meaningful, as they tend to be present in the majority of Space Marine competitive lists. I guess you could just use Eliminators or Infiltrators instead, though, to some extent. Overall, I feel like they're either kind of fairly even or slight winners, and I think either of those just aren't really quite good enough to really turn them around, given that they were arguably the weakest faction in 40k before. Perhaps one of the best interest for them is now for getting lots of veteran units on the table. 20 points with a lot of threat seems alright. They do still have some fun stuff from their detachment, including the Tome of Ectoclades, plus their redeployment type teleportarium things, but I feel like Games Workshop really could have done some buffing for the Primaris kill teams, unless they are just deliberately neglecting them to not encourage them more, and rumours about them potentially being consolidated or going away somehow might be true. It does feel like a minor boost if you're playing a fluffy Black Spear list though and taking loads of veterans. Finally, for the Divergent Marines, we have the Black Templars. Pre-updates, they were pretty well balanced in my opinion, win rates of 50% and doing okay both with Ironstorm, Gladius and Righteous Crusaders. Kind of as expected, they got fairly minimal changes from this update. Their unique vehicles went up to be 10 points more than the Gladiators, though it's a shame that their unique Repulsor didn't drop down a bit as well. The Loyalist one's now 180 and the Templar one is 20 points more. Their unique Repulsor and Impulsor gain the extra transport slots, though maybe aren't quite as relevant given that it's often Sword Brethren charging out of them. And like a few of the Divergent chapters, they got locked out of using some non-Templar units, so they can't take Librarians in any detachment now, and also every tank that they do take does need to pay the extra 10 points or 20 points for a multi-melter, though at 10 points I still think it's a good deal. Like the rest of Space Marines though, they got hit by the Ironstorm Spearhead nerfs, and that was one of their strong builds. That's going to be far less good than it was before, and the Land Raider Redeemer went up to 285, and that was a popular choice both in Ironstorm Spearhead and the other detachments, maybe disgorging some Sword Brethren into combat, them being a big Overwatch threat. Overall, between all that, it certainly feels like more nerfs than buffs. I put them as slight losers really, basically quite a big loss if you're playing Ironstorm Black Templars, but just slightly minimal changes or mild nerfs if you're going for Righteous Crusaders or Gladius, depending on whether or not you wanted to take a Land Raider Redeemer. I guess at least their signature Land Raider Crusader got a bit cheaper as well, so rewarding players who are taking the fluffy option there. Moving on to Chaos and starting out with the standard spiky Astartes, the Chaos Space Marines were doing kind of well post-Codex, win rates were around about 51%, they hadn't had their Codex out for long, and were looking kind of good, winning a few tournaments, but their win rate didn't seem overpowered, around about 51% seems kind of fine really. Having said all that, Games Workshop came down on them perhaps surprisingly hard. There was a fairly broad nerf to all sorts of competitive units. Legionaries, Predators, Vindicators, and the Venom Crawler all went up and all were quite strong before. Havoc's Accursed Cultists and Raptors all felt maybe a bit more questionable. Those units didn't tend to be present in the majority of lists at least, outside of specific detachments, and Warp Talons went all the way up to 135 in combination with a nerf that means they have to destroy units to return to reserves. I feel like out of anything, Warp Talons definitely needed something doing to them. They were just a bit too auto-include before, but I feel like at that points cost with that ability, you're now basically making them not worth it unless you're doing anything but trying to abuse rapid ingress with them. Otherwise for changes, Chaos Lords are a bit more relevant in a few more detachments given the stratagem changes. They won't be as good for anything that was 2 CP. There were a couple of errata things, including stopping different marked units getting into other marked transports once more, something that was unexpectedly missing from the Codex, and a Chaos Cult enhancement got a small boost, meaning that you can confer a scout move to other things that a Dark Commune or Dark Apostle can lead, but it's probably not the biggest thing in the world. For the Chaos Demons as well, Nurglings being OC0, not doing secondaries and actions and things, that'll be a blow to Chaos more generally. Overall, between all that, there's not a lot of good news. It does feel like maybe a bit of an overcorrection compared with where they were post their Codex release, and it seems like some Chaos players must be a bit annoyed that Games Workshop was quite so on it with doing balance changes right after a Codex drop when things like Necrons and Admech took absolutely ages for them to sort out. I don't think I would have gone this heavy myself, certainly doing something to Warp Talons, and I feel like Legionaries are still going to be absolutely great at 90. I'd guess that Chaos might be a little bit more mid-tier to low mid-tier after this. They don't seem to be absolutely ruined. For the Death Guard, they were fairly well balanced pre-update, around about 49% wins and most of their unique units usable. Games Workshop have largely seemed to have done internal balance changes with this. The common Plague Marine support characters, the Biologist Putrefier and Foul Blightspawn, both go up 10, but they're both still worth it at 60 points, and then some of the lesser played stuff went down a bit. Plague Surgeons, the Noxious Blightbringer, Blight Haulers, and Blight Lord Terminators. I feel like that's a really good selection of the units that just didn't really see competitive play that much. Blight Haulers genuinely look quite a nice support vehicle at 90 points. I did feel like they were a bit overcosted at 100, and it'd be interesting to see if anyone plays the Blight Lords. They're now easily the cheapest Terminator in the game by quite a long way. I'm still not sure if they'll still be overshadowed by Death Shroud and just not really considered too much. Otherwise, Mortarion got an FAQ confirming that he ignores damage modifiers, and that's quite a big deal against certain things like Redemptor Dreadnoughts or Catan. I believe that was a reversal of a previous ruling that they had for him, which is pretty massive. The Biologist Putrefier can't allow multiple grenade uses within the same phase anymore, though it's still absolutely great to have one of them. Again, Nurgling's OC0 means that they're a bit yet less used besides just board control. The more standard Chaos Lords get the stratagem changes, and indirect fire hurts the Plague Burst Crawlers a bit and makes the Lord of Virulence probably not really worth it. A lot of the time he's only going to be good for ignore cover now. Overall it is a fair few changes, though I wouldn't expect it to affect Death Guard strength massively. The support characters are still great, even if you might only want one Biologist Putrefier now. The Mortarion boost is good, and Blight Haulers look a lot more usable. I guess the biggest downsides are the indirect nerf and the Nurgling nerf. Interesting that Typhus still remains as auto-include as he is at 80 points. He'll still be pretty standout good at 90 points, and his big mortal wound attack didn't get any sort of restriction for targeting lone operatives, unlike quite a lot of similar rules. Broadly speaking, still looking pretty good for the Death Guard. Next up, the World Eaters were in a similar place in terms of win rates, around about 50-50, and some good tournament performance. They got some minimal changes from the Dataslate. 8-bound and Exalted 8-bound both go down in cost slightly. A couple of Cornate Demon datasheets got some points decreases if you wanted to take a Bloodthirster or something. And otherwise I feel like the majority of the rules changes are perhaps a little bit peripheral for World Eaters. I guess Angron might care a little bit about overhanging the base and fitting through tiny gaps. And 1 CP Heroic Intervention doesn't seem like the worst thing for a broadly melee army. Overall, I put them down as slight winners compared with before due to the 8-bound change, though I wouldn't really say that they've changed too meaningfully in this. Thousand Sons were previously one of the strongest armies in the game, win rates are around about 55%, and loads of good tournament performance, and they did certainly attract a fair bit of negative attention with lots of nerfs to the Kabbalistic rituals, but none of them individually are really too killer. And it was balanced a little bit by a few points cuts. Most of the rituals changed in some way. Twist of Fate went to AP2 in the shooting phase only, though it's still pretty epic both for Magnus's shooting and Warp Flamers. It's only one ritual per Psyker per turn, which reduces flexibility a little bit. Doombolt's confirmed to be a psychic attack and can't hit lone operatives greater than 12 inches away, which was a sneaky trick he could often do with the Mutalith Beast. Temporal Surge can't ever be double stacked, which could lead to some fairly ridiculous movement. The free stratagem ritual can now be used on non-battle tactics, but it's only -1 CP, and you can't use 2 double up on stratagems either. It could honestly amount to a buff though, if it makes more sense to spend the Cabal points rather than the CP. And finally the Exalted Sorcerer got a nerf, -2 to move and charge, and it doesn't apply to monster and vehicles, rather than the more powerful halving movement distances it had before. Basically the rules changes feel like they cut down on the sort of extra and slightly more janky uses of the rituals, but still keeps the core thing of what they do very much intact, and good to see that they haven't just completely ruined the faction's main mechanic. Hand in hand with that though, they got a points drop for the Mutalith, which is very nice as that was still seen in competitive lists. Not all of them, but it was good. Scarab Occult Terminators got a further drop down to 190, and the Exalted Disc Sorcerer went down to 105. Overall, from the combination of the lots of small nerfs to their rituals, I'd still say they're slight losers overall. A few of the most crazily powerful things have been reined in, but given how strong they were to start with, plus the points decreases, I feel like they really haven't made out of this too bad. For the Chaos Demons, they perhaps seem to have done one of the best out of the armies out of this data slate. They were starting from a point of being fairly mid-tier, around about wins of 49%, lots of armies tending to revolve mainly around their greater demons. Considering they were fairly balanced before, they got some big buffs to a lot of datasheets. Fiends, the Fate Skimmer, Demon Princes, and Plague Drones all went down, which I think was fair enough given that they were kind of rarely taken competitively, but several already good models went down. Bellicor and the Bloodthirster perhaps most notably, but I feel like Soul Grinders were already usable. Demonettes maybe weren't standout, but did still see occasional play in competitive lists. The Chaos Demons did eat the Nurgling change like the rest of Chaos, which will be a nerf to them, but I feel like that was outweighed by the enormous boost that they got to Greater Demons, where now they basically get their Shadow of Chaos rule for their own deity in an aura around 6 inches from them in a sort of similar way to Be'lakor, but you don't have to take the Dark Master. It means their deity units can deep strike closer, they can debuff morale, the Greater Demons themselves will heal from past battle shock tests, they get the boosted effect of their own enhancements all the time, which is kind of massive. And they can also opt to advance and charge for 1 CP in the Shadow of Chaos as well, as they'll always be inside it. Overall, demons are just massive winners out of this due to that change. I feel like the rules change really is quite a fun and fluffy one, and I feel like it is a good change overall, though I can't help but think that some of the greater demons possibly could have gone up in cost to reflect it. Chaos Demon armies tended to be very heavy on the greater demons before now, and certainly weren't doing terribly in game. This change just feels like it'll send them even further down Monster Mash as the way to play demons and maybe overshadow some of the other things, and it certainly looks like it works out as a massive direct power boost to the faction even if you played exactly the same lists as you did before. I certainly wouldn't be too surprised to see them doing far better in tournaments and things in the future. Next, we've got the Chaos Knights, who were again sort of mid-tierish, around about win rates of 47 to 48%, largely achieved with vast amounts of War Dogs. In terms of points changes, they had their Abominant and Despoiler drop down a bit, which seems like a sensible change. Pratt's might be getting to the sort of point where they might tempt a few people away from War Dogs to try them out. And then on the Forge World side of things, the Lancer, Styrex, Atropos, and Acheron all dropped down, as did the Lord of Dread enhancement a bit. That's the one that gives battle shock in the fight phase, which isn't huge but better here than most armies. The Lancer feels like a fairly standout change given that that was run really quite a lot of competitive armies, and even if the tank shock for it did get a bit worse, I wouldn't be surprised if a few more lists run one of those. For the demons, those cheaper skull cannons might potentially be of interest to Chaos Knights if you take some bloodletters as attacks. Handing out a battle shock test at long range for fairly cheap isn't the worst idea for a Chaos Knight army. Otherwise, the core changes made quite a lot of impact on the army. Tank shock's broadly going to be worse for most models besides Brigands or Tyrant Knights, which hurts a little. Titanic Knights get that kind of massive ability to just go through ruin walls, having the small risk of taking battle shock and saving your command points that you might have had to spend on the stratagem to do so. The indirect fire nerf will hit Brigands ignores line of sight a little bit. OC0 Nurglings again won't help Chaos Knights, they might be the single army that's actually most impacted by that change. And otherwise, for mission play, I feel like Mass War Dogs don't look too bad in the new Pariah Nexus missions. They'll enjoy anything that helps out battle line, and the new version of Bring It Down is fairly kind to medium vehicles like them, only giving up 2 victory points per model slain. Overall, I feel like they've done at least fairly well out of that. I've marked the Knights as slight winners compared with before. Maybe a bit more in terms of overall army balance than all-out power. I feel like the challenge for the rest of the index was more to catch up with Mass War Dogs, though it does feel like there's a lot more good reasons to run Titanic Knights than there were before now. I feel like perhaps the Lancer and the Despoiler could be some of the more interesting ones for big knights, though in terms of actual in-game strength and ball control and things, the Nurgling nerf will be felt a bit for doing those secondaries and actions. Moving on, let's talk through the Xenos armies, and starting out we have the Aeldari. Pre-update, their tournament win rates were around about 47%, certainly vastly lower than the 70% they had at the start of 10th edition after successive nerfs. In the update, they got points cuts to several Phoenix Lords, the Void Weaver, Viper, and Wraith Lord, but they got increases to a lot of their staples: Dark Reapers, Swooping Hawks, Sky Weaver jet bikes, Fire Dragons, Warp Spiders, Ivrain, and Shadow Spectres. On the points front, unfortunately, the nerfs far outweigh the buffs there. Most of those units really regularly appeared in tournaments in some combination. Maybe the Fire Dragons are perhaps the most surprising choice for a nerf there. Whereas I feel like the units buffed maybe just sort of gets them from a bit niche to interesting, as opposed to stand out amazingly strong. I kind of wonder if a few of the fast mover nerfs might have been in response to how good they will be in actions in the Pariah Nexus missions. Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders in particular look like they're great choices for jumping around the board doing actions, and they're kind of hard to prevent doing that. And they had a couple of other peripheral things. Fate dice are able to be used on a rerolled dice, which can be big with the battle host rerolls, and the nerf to indirect fire, probably taking that out of consideration for a lot of guard lists, is going to be a help to them. That was one of the things that Aeldari didn't really like too much, being able to hit things like their Warp Spiders and Swooping Hawks and things without being able to see them. Overall, despite the mission changes, I feel like they're probably going to be slight losers overall in terms of power-wise. Their win rates and tournament performance wasn't really spectacular before, and having the majority of their competitive units go up a bit is definitely going to be felt in an impact on real lists. For their Dark Kin, the Drukhari were doing pretty well before the update, around about a 50% win rate, though maybe a bit niche on the top tournament tables. Games Workshop maybe predictably kept them with minimal changes, Grotesques and Ravagers getting a small points cut, Scourges going up a little bit for a minimum size squad, though going down a bit for a maximum size squad. Grotesques and Ravagers are definitely both units I'd consider pretty competitive now. Scourges I'd still say are absolutely fine, though given that they were one of the most auto-include Drukhari units, the extra 20 or 30 points that you might spend on them will be felt. Again, with the Aeldari though, I guess having less indirect fire around might mean that the Scourges don't get shot by barrage weapons quite as much. Otherwise, the Archons changed their stratagem debuff to the new Lord of Deceit rule, meaning they're reducing command points for units nearby, and given that one of the things you do with Archons these days seems to be charge them off with Incubi and get Lance Melee, extra AP, and big rerolls, they are quite likely to wind up in the midst of the enemy army, so that rule might be felt quite a bit. I had an FAQ to Venoms talking about where they split the unit before the leaders attach. I guess that means you can't have really weird combinations of half a court of Archon and half a Cabalite Warrior unit. The court of the Archon would all have to go in one place, but you can still make a very scary unit with that and all the scary stuff out of a Cabalite squad. I think in general they'll broadly quite like the new, more action-focused missions with a lot of cheap, fast units, and Mandrakes will be pretty godly for that as well. Overall, I wouldn't say that they've had any changes that are too massive here. Feels like a side grade overall, with Scourges being a bit worse, but Grotesques and Ravagers being a bit better. Kind of a shame they didn't help out Hellions a bit, but overall I think they were in a good place and remain so. Tyranids maybe got one of the single biggest raft of changes along with AdMech. Games Workshop seriously taking a good look at the faction and trying to overhaul them, given that people were a bit disappointed with how they were doing in terms of things like reliance on certain units spawning objectives or battle shock kind of rules. Overall, there's more rules changes than points changes. For the points, the Biovorm, Euclid, Turvagon, and Big Ripper squads all dropped a bit. The New Relictor went up a bit, but also gained Synapse, so it's not all bad. And the single Ripper swarms went up a bit too, though there's certainly less reason to take them anymore given OC0 things don't do secondaries. The rules changes were kind of immense though. Brood Lords, the Parasite, and Neuralic all gained Synapse and Shadow in the Warp. Pretty handy for getting things out into the midfield, but doubly great because now Synapse gives you +1 strength in melee within 6 inches. That's enormous for certain units. That's pretty enormous for certain units like Strength 5 Genestealers or Strength 10 Norn Emissaries. And Synapse also debuffs the leadership test that you take when you do Shadow in the Warp as well, so even better there. The Hive Tyrant's Onslaught rule grants lethal hits, which is pretty amazing for mid-strength damage dealers like Exocrines, which were already really quite nice, and he has the new style free stratagems, so a bit more access, though it does mean no more double dipping on the 5+ feel no pain in invasion fleets. The Swarmlord gets new style command point debuffs within 12 inches, so I guess if you had him with some tanky Tyrant Guard and pushed him into the middle of the board, that could actually cause problems. Some of the big gun beasts got improvements. The Exocrines went up to strength 9 on their main gun, which is good against toughness 8 and toughness 9 targets, which isn't much, but they were already being spammed in most lists anyway, so any buff is pretty significant. And perhaps a bit more spectacularly, the Tyrannofex's Rupture Cannon went up to d6 plus 6 damage. If you manage to land a failed save with that, then it's going to be felt in a big way. Neurotyrants can lead Zoanthropes, which gives them +1 to hit. Technically, at the moment, it looks like it also gives them big guns never tire, though I'd guess they're going to patch that. Unending Swarm took a nerf with the reinforcements only being once per game, but Turvagons did drop down to 175 points, and having all the gaunts being strength 4 in Synapse is one buff, I suppose. Vanguard Onslaught has gained Morlocks, Trigons, and Raveners, all pretty interesting units for some of the stratagems and things. They did have the nerf to the 12-inch Can't Shoot Me stratagem and the enhancement for redeploys though. Crusher Stampede gives you +2 OC, and that means that you get at least some advantage from it whether or not monsters are injured, which I guess is nice, plus there's a stratagem that allows you to smash through ruin walls a bit easier. I don't think that on balance though it's going to be enough to make it good. As mentioned, OC0 units not doing actions isn't great for Rippers or Spore Mines, but there's far less dependence on them now. And finally, the Hydra the Barbed and the Scythed one, went to Legends. Kind of a shame for people who own the models, but maybe not the most competitive choices around for the most part. Overall, it's a pretty massive update for Tyranids with all sorts of things changing around for them. I certainly rank them as overall winners compared with before. The best thing that they got was lots more that can actually affect the big tough things in the enemy army. Things like lethal hits, +1 strength, and bigger scarier guns will all help with that. Hopefully toughness 10 or more things won't give them quite as many problems. Kind of a shame for Unending Swarm, which didn't really feel like it needed the nerf. I'm still not sure it's completely unplayable though, given the strength boost, improvements to plenty of other things, and the Turvigon drop. I would guess that we'll probably see less of it at top tournaments though. Overall, I feel like the Tyranids have done quite well out of the update. Next up, the Genestealer Cults had win rates of around about 52% pre-codex, then their new book dropped, and unfortunately there were quite a lot of nerfs in there. Still some pretty interesting stuff, but their standard detachment I think was weaker than the one that they had before, and they had a lot of nerfs to things that actually could deal with big tough enemy stuff, whether it was neophyte seismic cannons, aberrant weapons, or demo charges. As expected, Games Workshop did what people were thinking they'd do, and broader unit costs went down for the most part. Maybe stand out there are things like neophytes that dropped down to 70 points, which seems a lot more in line with their new abilities, as they were a big massive 90 before. They still have some scary buffs that they can access, and that still doesn't seem too bad for a squad that has the potential to respawn, even if Battle Line don't get the buff anymore. The Acolytes, Trucks, and Rock Grinders all dropped a bit. Aberrants and Jackals still unfortunately seem kind of pricey for what they do. Aberrants only went down to 150. The Benefactors is 80 points, which is kind of expensive. They will genuinely add a bit of threat against heavy stuff between his own psychic shooting and the lethal hits. Otherwise, for the Dataslate rules changes, the Nexus, their stratagem is now only applicable on one battle round and is just -1 CP. That was changed in the errata. And potentially respawning deep striking ambushers with a lot of battle line seems like it's quite a good advantage to have in the new missions. Feels like they might pick up a bunch of peripheral benefits depending on the exact mission that you're playing. Overall, I feel like, as with the Sisters, it's a new codex and needs a bit of tournament testing at the moment. My instincts on the first points are probably that it's not going to be particularly strong, at least in the context of other armies, maybe towards the sort of lower mid sort of range of Warhammer 40k based on first reads. There are some pretty interesting rules and combos within the detachments, and it's going to be interesting to see what people make of it when they turn up with Genestealer Cult armies to tournaments. Next up, the leagues of Votann were at least fairly well balanced before, win rates around 47%, often using a lot of Sagittor and Hernkin rushes, though pretty much all units in their index were pretty playable, maybe not overall in the worst place. The main update they got was a points cost for those Hernkin Jaegers at last. They're 80 points it would seem, which is kind of massive. Pretty much auto-include for a unit of 10 fairly sturdy infiltrators at that cost. They're not exactly the most high-threat unit in the world, but genuinely aren't awful against enemy troops if you might throw the odd judgment token into the mix. And it's more important that units of infiltrators be durable as opposed to big damage dealers, and I feel like they do that really well. They're super important in the context of the League's army, given that they've got so many scout moves. It means that you can put them down in the midfield and know that there's a bit of the board that you're going to be safe to scout into to rush things up and gain lines of sight. Otherwise, they had a few FAQs for the ruthless efficiency, nominating things for big judgment marking. They said that you can't use them on transported units, but you can select reserves units. The transported thing is a bit annoying if your opponent had a super big destructive unit in a Land Raider or something. Gaining the 3 CP doesn't stop you from gaining your regular one each battle round, as you'd expect. And there was an interesting thing that was clarified as an interaction between appraising glare and a long list. The one gives you extra judgment on objectives, and the other allows you to move judgment tokens around when they kill things, and apparently you can use the one enhancement to farm judgment tokens from the other. Otherwise, I guess the tank shock thing could be kind of relevant. Both Sagittors and Hecaton Land Fortresses will get a few more dice to throw at mortal wounds more than they had. Overall, it's a small boost to the Leagues of Votann army. It's not going to completely revolutionise them, but I feel like Hernkin Jaegers are pretty much auto-include at 80 points. Really nice and important for an army dependent on scout moves to get where they want to be, and that will add a bit of overall strength to the army. Next up, the Greenskins had win rates of around about 55% pre-update. They're one of the single strongest armies in the game, and the single most played. Lots of tournaments were getting stomped flat by bully boys in particular. Big chunky and scary Meganobs having a lot of violence to offer. Games Workshop have hit their top stuff with quite a lot of nerfs though. The Meganobs, if anything, looked like they were probably over-nerfed. taking a massive jump from 30 points to 40, and the 4 plus Feel No Pain dropping down to a 5 plus. Between those two, it feels like they just flipped from being genuinely great to kind of mediocre at best. As well as that, they've got nerfs to the Pain Boys, Pain Boss, and Weird Boy. I guess the Pain Boys and the Weird Boys primarily because of the Green Tide, and also to Boss Snickrot. Besides that, they hit Green Tide with a bunch of rules nerfs. Invulnerable saves are worse. You still get the 5 plus, but you no longer get the rerolls, and then it drops to a 6 plus once you've depleted the unit. The Tide of Muscle and their Surge move stratagem are both worse than they were, though still usable. Otherwise, trucks won't tank shot quite as hard, and there was a bit of a surprising FAQ for the Orc War Boss, basically saying that you don't get the +3 attacks if you called the War while he was in a transport. That feels like quite an unintuitive ruling to me. War Bosses are great datasheets, but I'm not really sure that this was the way to nerf them if they wanted to. Otherwise, for core things, I guess cheaper heroic intervention won't hurt melee-focused Orky armies, and Gretchen and Storm Boys look like they're in a good place to do well out of actions in the Pariah Nexus missions. For people who are still playing Green Tide as well, that is a lot of battle line there. Again, for some missions that could be super important. Overall though, they've definitely taken really quite a lot of nerfs. Green Tide and Bully Boys were the two best attachments, and both were hit really hard in their own ways. Mega Knobs certainly feel like they were overcorrected. I guess a few more lists might be using things like Squighog Boys, or maybe War Bosses with knobs, and I wouldn't be too surprised if a few more people switch back to Warhorde again. Though at first glance it still probably seems like both Green Tide and Bully Boys are playable. I'll be interested to see what Orc players make of the changes though. It was maybe a bit sad that a few of the lesser played units didn't get some help. I feel like the Buggies or the Speed War could maybe use something to help them catch up a bit. That was just notably underpowered compared with the rest of the detachments in the book. For the Necrons, it broadly seems to be more bad news for them. Pre-updates, they were still being played really quite a lot, second most played in the game, and still doing fairly well, with around about a 52% win rate. Builds mainly going around Canoptech Court and Hypercrypt as before. They didn't get too many changes, but the ones they did all feel like they sting a bit. For Canoptech Court, race went up to 125, which is kind of painful given that they were often using 18 of them. Spamming those will be a massive increase in points, and the Doomstalker goes up to 145, again commonly run in trios in Canoptech Court. For Hypercrypt, Canoptech Precision can't target monsters, so no 3-inch deep strikes for Catan, though it still remains a good stratagem for other things. And the can't shoot me outside of 12 inches stratagem for Canoptech Court became 18 inches, so just a bit harder to deny shooting to midfield things at least. Overlords, I think, were generally helped more than they were harmed by the free stratagem changes. They could do things like free Overwatch if they wanted, and have a few more options for various detachments like Awakened Dynasty. Scarabs being OC 0 won't help for actions, though they can still get a bit of OC if they're near Cryptex, and a couple of rules that needed multiple criteria satisfied to activate their buffs were clarified in an FAQ. There's an Awakens Dynasty stratagem plus the Locust Destroyer core rule. Games Workshop now said that you need to have both of those parts active to activate the second more powerful part of the boost, which did seem like a nerf, as I feel like they'd ruled the opposite way before. Finally, they got some Forge World unit removals. They lost Canoptech Acanthrites as maybe the most competitively played option out of any, and also the Tombstalker, Tomb Sentinel, and Tesseract arc, all of which are sent to Legends and their models taken down from the web store. Overall, between all that, it's a fairly solid nerf to the dynasties. Canoptech Court got hit far more than other stuff. If anything, I kind of wonder if they maybe went a bit too far with that. Maybe things like 5 or 10 points increases on the Wraiths and Doomstalkers might have been fine. Hypercrypt doesn't really look like it's been hurt too badly. Catan can still get some good value by jumping to the front of the enemy army, even if you don't get the 3-inch deep strike. At least they can threaten to charge if they do that. And I guess the changes might have a few more people looking at Awakened Dynasty again, which people were certainly playing to some good success prior to the updates. I guess that might be a bit more tempting if fewer people are playing Canoptech Court. Would be nice to see a few boosts in return though, things like Triarch Praetorians, Warriors, or maybe the Annihilation Legion somehow. But overall, I feel like Necrons are going to be a fair bit less standout and looking a lot more mid-tier than they were before. I feel like the main change might just be less people playing Canoptech Court and more people going for Hypercrypt or Awakened. Finally, we've got the Tau Empire. Pre-updates, they were winning around about 47% of games, perhaps a slightly mediocre reception given the points changes after the Codex, but people were still managing to do okay with them at tournaments. It just wasn't really all that easy. Given being kind of mid-tier but not overblown, I feel like Games Workshop were actually really generous to them with these changes. Broadsides dropped down from 110 to 90 points, which is massive. They just jumped from being kind of underwhelming gun platforms to perhaps some of the best gun platforms in the codex, and hammerheads at the same time went up to 145. It just feels like the broadsides will be the new best way to destroy armor. Otherwise, perhaps the most exciting change is that all the crisis variants drop down 20 points and the commanders drop a bit too. That's a huge boost to core units in the army, and again it feels like they go from being kind of mediocre to utterly great. Otherwise, the strike team is down to 75. Farsight's free stratagems can get some more choice. They could do a 1 command point 3-inch drop in retaliation cadre. Broadside's mortal wounds ability works against devastating wounds again, and Riptides and the tower tanks can tank shock a little bit better, though Farsight not quite as well. For nerfs from the changes, the Puretide engram chip got the rough end of the stratagem changes and now basically does nothing. Hopefully they update that to do something a bit more meaningful. And the reinforcement change was a nerf to the Kroot detachment, unfortunately, which I don't think needed it. You're only going to be able to recycle one big squad of carnivores over the course of the game, rather than having multiple units pop up one by one. Overall, besides the Kroot, for General Tower though, I feel like they're really quite big winners from the update. Anti-tank's probably going to flip straight from being Hammerhead Central to Broadside Central. I'm sure people will still be using lots of Riptides, but I think we're going to see a lot more Crisis Suits and Commanders on the table once again. And in particular, it feels like Retaliation Cadre is a big winner out of this one. That one really needed the Crisis Suits to be good to be a strong detachment in itself. Overall, not the worst changes in the world for the greater good. In any case, a pretty massive update there. Let me know your takes on your given factions and which ones you think did better or worse. Just for rounding it up, I feel like perhaps the bigger winners of the data slates were maybe Amec with their big damage output, Tyranids with all their rules changes, Demons with the greater demons just going to the next level, and Custodians and Imperial Knights both got some fairly good changes on the Imperial side of things. For biggest losers in terms of raw nerfs, I feel like Hell Space Marines didn't do so great out of this, harsher nerfs than I would have guessed. And for the top tier armies, I maybe feel like Orks and Necrons got hit really quite hard comparatively, with maybe things like Space Wolves, Thousand Suns, and Grey Knights taking smallish nerfs but still going to be really quite strong overall. It doesn't look like it's a good time for Deathwatch or Core Codex Space Marines though, having not really got particularly significant improvement and arguably starting out from a place of weakness, at least by tournament win rate stats. And I feel like Aeldari maybe haven't come out of this too great as well, taking quite a lot of hits despite again having not the best win rate before, though maybe the missions will help that out for them. In any case, we'll be looking forward to seeing how armies get on with this. I'll certainly take a look at some tournament army lists when we get them. I'll be aiming to make a few more focus videos on some of the other factions, plus cover the Pariah Nexus update, so feel free to stay tuned if you'd like to see any of that. As mentioned earlier in the video, if you did want to help support Auspex Tactics when you pick up any miniatures at all, feel free to check out those links down in the video description. There's Element Games in the UK at 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21% off, Fenris Workshop in Canada for 10% off, and Wargame Portal in the USA for 15% off. A big thank you to any of you guys supporting the channel in that way, it does help out. Finally, otherwise if you wanted to help the channel more directly, I do have the Patreon page linked in the video description, and that's the main reason that I can keep on making videos like this quite as regularly as I do. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways each month, so feel free to check out that if any of that sounds interesting or you'd like to help support. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.